Thank you.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your new capacity and why you're interested in this bill. And you heard a few questions from committee members, and maybe you can comment on those too.
Absolutely. Well, Senator Sears, thank you so much for inviting me to come back to
By
the
the way,
great.
Senator Benning is in court today, and Senator Baruth's in Albuquerque, and I have no idea what's in Albuquerque.
I
Other
believe
than
it's
sand.
Sunshine.
I believe it's
Yeah.
Sunshine and sand? I don't know.
I
Never
think it's
been
for
to
his
Albuquerque.
job. I think it's for his other job.
Okay.
Anyway, I apologize for not being here. So you have the three most important members.
I see that. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for having me back. And yes, and we also appreciate Jimmy Garoppolo. That was a very kind gift from the New England Patriots.
It was.
James Dole, for the record. I'm the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids, which is a human rights organization that is advocating on behalf and trying to advance human rights protections for kids in various systems, including the criminal justice system, as well as in education, child welfare, and juvenile justice. Central to our organizing principle is the idea that when we look at how most kids end up in the criminal justice system, it's as a result of adverse childhood experiences and early childhood trauma. We believe that most of the social ills in our country could be traced back to the harm that children experience in their early childhood. And so what we're trying to do is raise awareness about the connection between ACEs and these negative life outcomes for children. And that's really what kind of brings us into Vermont today to talk about this really important piece of legislation. And, you know, the genesis for this for me, I shall say, is when I was first working at Polaris Project on anti-human trafficking legislation. As a matter of fact, I think the same year I was working and came to speak to the committee, I came across the case of Sara who at that time was serving a life without parole sentence in the state of California for having killed her sex trafficker. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get her on the phone a little later so committee members can directly hear her story. But for me, it was the first time that I really learned that these draconian punishments were really imposed on children at all, let alone a child sex trafficking victim who had only been in that situation because of somebody who had been raping and trafficking her. And I wish I could say that that was the only instance in the country where we see cases like this. And I used to think too, like, well, maybe it was just because it was so long ago, 1994, that her case happened. So we didn't know a whole lot about sex trafficking at the time. So a lot of people could be forgiven maybe for not realizing what happens to a child sex trafficking victim and why they end up in those situations, and why they might see their only way out as killing their trafficker. Unfortunately, last year in the state of Wisconsin, they charged a 15-year-old girl, Crystal Kaiser, with killing a man who had been raping and trafficking her. Crystal, she's currently on trial right now, going through the process. She was a young girl who, like most trafficking victims, had been abused and neglected and exploited her entire life. And there was a man who took advantage of that and exploited her vulnerabilities. And actually, ironically, police had identified that he was a pedophile who had over 200 images of child pornography on his computer. He had been arrested. He gets released on bond. Within 2 weeks from his release, he's exploiting Crystal again. So she goes over to his house. He's trafficking her. He's exploiting her through prostitution, and she then kills him. And of course, they lock her up right away and are charging her with first-degree murder. A couple of years ago in Ohio, there's a young girl by the name of Alexis Martin. Alexis was 15 years old. Now, she actually wasn't the person who killed her trafficker. She was a felony murder case. She was 15 years old. She had been raped and trafficked by this man, and she decided that she was going to enter an agreement with a bunch of other boys to rob her trafficker. So she is in the next room being raped by her trafficker's brother. When the boys come in, rob her trafficker, and then one of the boys, a 16-year-old, shoots and kills him. So they charge her with felony murder, and she gets a life with parole sentence after 25 years. Folks might remember the case of Centoya Brown. Governor Haslam in Tennessee commuted her sentence last year. She was freed in August. She had received a life with parole sentence after she had served 54 years, a minimum of 54 years, for having killed a John who had picked her up and was attempting to rape her. Her trafficker was a man by the name of Cutthroat, who had been a brutal guerrilla pimp who had forced her into this situation, and the man who picked her up at a Sonic. She was hungry, and he bought her food, and then brought her back to his house, and that's where the murder occurred. So all across the country, we see instances of these very vulnerable children who oftentimes are engaged in other criminal behavior. And because of the grooming process that they go through, because of the history of violence and trauma that they've experienced, they've developed a traumatic bond with their abuser, with their exploiter, with their trafficker, and oftentimes see no other way out. Now, unfortunately, there's a gap in the law. Most folks, when they hear these stories, are like, well, why didn't they qualify for self-defense? That's sort of the general thought. The problem with the self-defense statutes, and the reason why Section 1 in S-217 is needed, is because oftentimes in order to benefit from a self-defense theory, you need to be able to show that there was an imminent threat or danger where your life was in danger or you were going to suffer great bodily harm. Because many of these cases involve girls who act in premeditation, where they do plan out to kill their trafficker. And it's a very unfortunate situation, but because of that dynamic, what will happen is they will face the exact same mandatory minimum sentencing that anybody else convicted of first-degree murder would, or any other crime that they might commit against their abuser. It's unfortunate that this is the reality where we still see folks in law enforcement, prosecutors bringing charges against kids in these situations. It's an abhorrent practice. It is a violation of these children's human rights. Article 39 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child specifically states that the obligation of the state, when you're dealing with a child who's experienced trauma and harm in a form of trafficking, is to focus on the treatment and rehabilitation of these children, not to lock them away in cages. And that's exactly what's happening in these instances. And so Section 1 of this bill is really concerned with making sure that there are adequate safeguards in place so that, God forbid, any case like this ever arises here in the state of Vermont, a child in that situation will be protected and not suffer an added human rights violation of getting a lengthy prison sentence. Now, this doesn't mandate that the judge do anything. There's still a requirement that the person who is accused of committing a very serious crime prove by clear and convincing evidence that they are in fact a trafficking victim and that the person whom they've committed the offense against was the person who did this to them. But if a judge does in fact find that, what we're basically saying is let's take the handcuffs off of judges so that they're not required to just impose a life sentence and a lengthy mandatory minimum, but can actually come up with an age-appropriate and trauma-informed response in situations like this.
Should we try Sarah again? It may be that I'm looking, she's in California.
Yes.
It's only 6 a.m. there. That may be why she's...
Yeah.
I did email her. She didn't get back to me, but let's try. Sorry, I didn't mean over you.
Oh, that's fine.
Good morning, Sarah. This is Senator Dick Sears. You're with the Senate Judiciary Committee here in Vermont. Thank you for being available. I know it's extremely early out in California. James Dole is here and has been talking about you, and you're going to be our next witness. But I understood you wanted to listen to some of James's testimony. We have a number of people in the room. Also, it is being filmed by a local cable television outlet. So, just so you're aware of that. And can you hear us okay?
Yes, you guys sound great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
we might turn it up just a little bit. But so we're going to be listening to James's testimony, then you'll be the next witness. And thank
Okay,
you
great.
for
Thank you.
accommodating our 9 a.m. here, 6 a.m. out there.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, good, thank you. James, go ahead.
Thank you. And morning, Sarah. And so that is really the genesis for the law. And I will say, there's been a recent shift in the way that we've looked at juveniles over the last 15 to 20 years, really beginning with the emergence of juvenile brain and behavioral development science that has shown that there are fundamental differences between juvenile and adult brains. In particular, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for executive functioning. It's not fully developed in children, which is why children rely on a more primitive part of the brain called the amygdala to make decisions and process information. That part of the brain and that process of development is hindered and inhibited when children experience severe amounts of trauma. And so you have to sort of look at, the brain development in conjunction with the trauma that children experience. And the Supreme Court actually of the United States has noted this in a series of recent decisions, in a series of decisions called Roper, Miller, Graham, and Montgomery. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that the penological justifications for imposing harsh punishments on children begin to fall away when we look at the developmental differences of who they are. And perhaps nowhere is there a better example of that than children in situations like this, where they've committed acts of violence or committed crimes against the people who've abused them. And so this is really about creating a new standard by which judges can look at these cases, look at kids in situations like Sarah, like Centoya, like Alexis, and make sure that we're not adding additional trauma to what they've already experienced. And the last thing I'll just say is, as you listen to Sarah's testimony, the one thing that I would really urge committee members to do is just think about if Sarah was your daughter, or Sarah or Alexis was your daughter, or one of these other girls was your daughter, what would you want to have happen in situations like this? Would you want a judge to have to impose the harshest possible punishment because they're mandated by law? Or would you want the law to have flexibility enough to create a trauma-informed and age-appropriate response? And that's what this is truly about. In my testimony, in the folder, you'll find a couple of stories. Absolutely. There are stories from around the country. Alexis's story, Crystal's story is attached to my testimony. There's also, on the right-hand side, a number of stories that have been written about the work that Sarah and I have been doing around the country to raise awareness about this issue. The HuffPost has covered it. Bills have been introduced on this issue all around the country, including recently in the U.S. Congress by a Republican Congressman, Bruce Westerman, from Arkansas. For context about Congressman Westerman, he occupies the 4th Congressional District in Arkansas, which is the former seat of Tom Cotton. Many would say probably the most conservative member of the U.S. Senate, so it's a very conservative district. And so just for context about the bipartisan nature by which these bills have been introduced and the support across the political spectrum for making sure that kids in situations like this don't have to receive these harsh punishments. And with that, I'm happy to yield my time for questions on the law about anything within Section 1 or any questions in general. I'll just say, too, I meant to mention this earlier, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center National Hotline has received about 124 instances since 2007 of human trafficking cases here in Vermont, 24 cases from 2018 alone. So this is a very real problem that Vermont has, in fact, been dealing with. And what we see when we look even beyond that, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that roughly 100,000 U.S. children are exploited in prostitution every single year. And about 1 in 9 girls conservatively and 1 in 53 boys, again, very conservative estimates, are victims of childhood sexual abuse. I'm actually a survivor of child sexual abuse and child labor trafficking myself. It was one of the impetuses for forming Human Rights for Kids and wanting to address these issues. And so when we look at all this, it's important to understand the context in which this is happening and being able to create a legal system that is more flexible and able to respond to cases like this. And so with that, I'll go ahead and yield my time. But we would definitely urge the committee to support this legislation and thank Senator Sears very much for bringing it. He's been a stalwart champion for many, many years on these issues, and we thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sarah, please go ahead.
Excuse me, thank you.
And thank you for the bravery of being here with us this morning.
Thank you. I really believe in the why behind it. So I'll go ahead and start. So my name is Sara and James, and for the majority of my life, I was identified cruise on W59700 while haunted by horrendous and embarrassing unspeakable situations that I was subjected to by adults and the community members in my life. To this day, I'm in therapy attempting to make sense of the why behind it all. Being an invisible voice as an unidentified victim of child sex trafficking for so many years, I find that Sarah's law would allow judges the discretion to make decisions based on trauma-informed best practices to enhance the overall wellness of our children who come in contact with our justice system. The vast majority of children in the justice system are contending with early childhood trauma and unmitigated adverse childhood experiences. I was one of them. I experienced 10 out of the 10 adverse childhood experiences. When I was in elementary school, and the 11-year adult whose life was abruptly interrupted by George Howard, the man who would soon rob me of my childhood. Coming home from school, he was able to, convince me to get in his car. I lived in a community where drugs and abuse were the norm, and I was an easy target for him and his sinister intentions. I also think that he was a man who himself was coming from a place of unidentified trauma. From the ages of 13 to 16, I was sex trafficked. The horrific types of abuse and rape and torture I encountered my trafficker and other adult males. And at 16, through an act of violence, I shot and killed him. Despite being a victim of child sex trafficking, sex abuse, and rape, by the man who I killed, I was tried as an adult, where none of the abuse and complex traumas I experienced throughout my childhood were admitted into evidence. I had no victim's advocate. I had no therapeutic modalities dealing with trauma. Informed care offered to me, and as a rape victim, I was my only witness. After 2.5 days on trial, I was ordered to pay $10,000 in victim's restitution and to serve a life without parole sentence plus 4 years. The judge and the media depicted me only as a sophisticated monster, the worst of the worst, and sentenced me as such. The justice system sentenced me for killing the man who victimized me for nearly a third of my young life. And years later, thanks to tireless work of my legal team and community advocates, my sentence was commuted and reduced by former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. After 19 years and 7 months, I was paroled. And what happened to me was not justice. What happened to other children of child sex trafficking victims like Alexis Martin, and Cecilia Brown in Tennessee, who also received life for crimes committed against their trafficker, is not justice. None of us should have to be sent to prison in the first place. It's a far too common response for girls of color in our country, especially for actions that are taken against our rapists and traffickers. Being silenced, sexually assaulted, raped, trafficked, and degraded creates deep wounds, especially for us as children. And every day, these wounds require courage, grace, and sanctifying strength to overcome. When I was silenced, I felt invisible. I felt my voice and life experiences held no value. That I, as a person, had no value. I was labeled as a child prostitute, a murderer, a convicted teen killer, and a teen prostitute who killed her pimp, and was sent to live out the rest of my days in prison, like an animal. All the sympathy and compassion seemed to be reserved for my rapist and sex trafficker, and very little for me. Nelson Mandela once said there is no keener revelation of society's soul than the way we treat our children. What does it say about our soul then if we allow our children who have been trafficked to be sentenced to decades in prison for having committed crimes against their rapists without offering them opportunity to heal? I believe that the children of Vermont deserve better than this, as all children. I believe that Sarah's law would allow discretion to make sure what has happened to me never happens to a child victim in Vermont. And under this legislation, judges will be given greater flexibility in cases like mine to deviate from mandatory minimum sentences and suspend any sentences as so to not keep a child victim in cages and silenced. I believe that children like us deserve to be protected by the system and not traumatized by it. And this legislation before you offers an opportunity to contribute to a healing component within our justice system that is very needed. So I ask, let us not allow the justice system to take anything else away from child trafficking victims and sexual abuse survivors. We have been forced to give away too much already. And Vermont has an opportunity to do better and be a national leader so that child trafficking victims in situations like mine are met with empathy, compassion, understanding, and love. And may we, with mindful intentions, end our continuous act of violence upon one another. So I say thank you with deep regard and respect for having an opportunity to share. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes.
Can't imagine how difficult it is for you. Questions?
No.
It's hard to, very difficult testimony to hear how you were first misused by the abuser and the trafficker, and then misused by the criminal justice system. So, thank you for being willing to speak out. Too often people aren't willing to speak out, and that's why these things continue. I think the committee is at a point where it probably doesn't have questions, but if you would like to stay on the line, and James is still here, and we have some other witnesses, you're welcome to. But again, my thanks for your willingness to come forward to try to change the laws so that other children don't have to go through what you went through.